This warship was born an Italian dreadnought, reborn as a fascist fast battleship, and died a Soviet enigma. This is the story of the Giulio Cesare, a vessel that defied obsolescence and cheated death in a global war, only to meet a mysterious, violent end in the supposed safety of its new home port, sparking a Cold War whodunit that endures to this day. Why should you watch this? Because this isn't just the biography of a ship, it's a tale of engineering audacity, the fury of naval combat, and an unsolved mystery wrapped in the Iron Curtain. In the early 20th century, the great powers were in the grip of a fever, a naval arms race fueled by national pride and the revolutionary design of a single British warship, HMS Dreadnought. Italy, a new and ambitious nation on the European stage, was determined not to be left behind in the churning wake of its rivals. The Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, needed its own dreadnoughts to project power across what they considered Mare Nostrum, our sea. From this ambition, the Conte di Cavour class was born, and with it, in 1910, the keel of a ship named for one of history's most audacious commanders, Giulio Cesare, or Julius Caesar. Laid down at the Ansaldo shipyard in Genoa, she was a product of her time. When she was commissioned in 1914, just as the storm clouds of the Great War gathered, she displaced over 25,000 tons, fully loaded and bristled with 13 massive 305mm guns. It was an impressive number of guns, arranged in a somewhat peculiar layout with a mix of twin and triple turrets, one of which was mounted midships, giving her a powerful but cluttered silhouette. With a top speed of around 21 knots, she was on par with her contemporaries. She was a symbol of Italian industrial might, a steel testament to a nation's naval aspirations. Yet, for all her power, her first life was remarkably quiet. World War I in the Mediterranean was not a war of grand fleet actions like Jutland. It was a war of blockade, of raids, of skirmishes in the narrow, treacherous waters of the Adriatic Sea. The Austro-Hungarian fleet, the Regia Marina's primary adversary, rarely ventured from its protected bases. The fear of submarines and mines turned the sea into a minefield of paranoia. So, the Giulio Cesare and her sisters spent the war as a fleet in being, a powerful deterrent that accomplished its mission primarily by existing. She undertook a few patrols, spent some time at the advanced base of Taranto, but she never fired her main guns in anger. Her most significant contribution was simply tying down enemy naval forces. When the armistice was signed in 1918, the Cesare was a veteran in name only, a giant that had slumbered through the conflict it was built for. The post-war years were no more exciting. The 1920s saw naval budgets slashed worldwide, and the Cesare spent her time on ceremonial duties, training cruises, and showing the flag. By the dawn of the 1930s, she was an aging dreadnought, slow and outmatched by newer, faster vessels being built by France, Italy's most likely naval rival. In an age of rapid technological advancement, the Giulio Cesare was destined for the scrapyard. But Italy, under the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, had other plans. Scrapping a ship named for Julius Caesar was politically unthinkable. Instead, the Regia Marina embarked on one of the most radical and ambitious warship reconstruction programs ever attempted. Between 1933 and 1937, the Giulio Cesare was taken into the Cantieri del Tirreno shipyard in Genoa and systematically disemboweled. This wasn't a refit, it was a resurrection. Workers ripped out her central turret to make space for new, more powerful machinery. Her old coal and oil-fired boilers were replaced with modern high-pressure Yarrow boilers, and new geared turbines were installed. The result was a staggering increase in power, from 31,000 shaft horsepower to over 93,000. Her original blunt bow was sliced off, and a new, elegant clipper bow was grafted on, adding over 30 feet to her overall length. This, combined with the new power plant, transformed her performance. The old 21-knot dreadnought was now a sleek, modern warship capable of reaching 28 knots. She was now a true fast battleship. Her armament received an equally dramatic overhaul. The remaining 10 305mm guns were bored out to 320mm, and they were given new liners and breech mechanisms. This increased their range and hitting power significantly, allowing them to fire a heavier shell over 26,000 yards. Her secondary battery was completely replaced with a modern suite of 120mm guns in twin turrets, and a formidable array of anti-aircraft weaponry was added, a crucial feature for the coming age of air power. Her armor protection was improved, particularly against plunging fire and torpedoes, with the application of the innovative Puglier's torpedo defense system, a series of crushing tubes designed to absorb and dissipate the energy of an underwater explosion. When she emerged from the shipyard in 1937, she was barely recognizable. The cluttered dreadnought was gone, replaced by a vessel with the clean, predatory lines of a modern warship, complete with a distinctive new tower bridge structure. She was, for all intents and purposes, a new ship, a testament to the ingenuity of Italian naval architects. She was faster, more powerful, better protected, and ready for a new war. She had been reborn as a modern gladiator, ready to fight for a new Roman Empire. When Italy entered World War II in June of 1940, the Giulio Cesare was one of the most powerful ships in the Mediterranean. As flagship of the 1st Battle Squadron under Admiral Inigo Campioni, she was immediately thrown into the fray. Just 1 month later, on the 9th of July, 1940, she would have her first and most famous taste of combat. During a large operation to escort a convoy to North Africa, the Italian fleet clashed with the British Mediterranean Fleet under Admiral Andrew Cunningham in an action that would become known as the Battle of Calabria, or the Battle of Punta Stilo. The two fleets sighted each other at extreme range, and a running gunnery duel began. The Cesare, along with her sister ship, the Conte di Cavour, opened fire on the British battleships from over 13 miles away. The British flagship, HMS Warspite, a veteran of Jutland and herself a thoroughly modernized vessel, returned fire. For several minutes, huge geysers of water erupted around the ships as the naval titans traded blows across the glittering sea. Then it happened. A single 381mm shell from the Warspite, fired from the incredible range of about 26,000 yards, slammed into the Giulio Cesare. It was one of the longest-range naval gun hits in history. The shell struck the aft funnel, and its fragments penetrated the deck, starting fires in an ammunition handling room for one of her anti-aircraft guns. Thick, acrid smoke was drawn down into the boiler rooms, forcing 4 of them to be shut down. Her speed plummeted to just 18 knots. Seeing the flagship slowing and shrouded in smoke, the Italian fleet laid a heavy smokescreen and disengaged. The Cesare had been wounded, but not critically. Within an hour, her damage control parties had extinguished the fires, and her engineers had restored power, allowing her to get back up to speed. She had faced the Royal Navy's finest and survived. The battle was inconclusive, but the Cesare had proven that she was a potent fighting machine. 4 months later, fate would smile on her again. On the night of the 11th of November 1940, the British launched a daring air raid on the Italian fleet's main base at Taranto. 21 antiquated swordfish biplanes, launched from the aircraft carrier HMS Illustrious, flew into the heavily defended harbour armed with torpedoes and bombs. They achieved devastating success. 3 Italian battleships were hit and sunk or heavily damaged at their moorings. The Conte di Cavour, Cesare's sister, was struck by a torpedo and sank in the shallow water, never to be fully repaired. The brand new battleship Littorio was hit by 3 torpedoes and put out of action for months. The Cesare, however, was untouched. By sheer luck, she was moored in a position that made her a difficult target for the torpedo bombers. She emerged from the chaos of Taranto completely unscathed, a survivor of one of the most decisive naval air attacks in history. A week later, she took part in another inconclusive fleet action, the Battle of Cape Spartivento, where she exchanged fire with British cruisers at long range but scored no hits. But the strategic situation in the Mediterranean was changing. The combination of British air power, fuel shortages, and a cautious Italian high command meant that the great fleet actions became rarer. The Cesare's main role shifted to escorting vital convoys to supply the Axis forces in North Africa. This was dangerous, unglamorous work, constantly under the threat of British submarines and aircraft. Still, she performed her duties reliably. By the end of 1942, however, Italy's crippling fuel shortage had become so severe that the Regia Marina could no longer afford to send its battleships to sea. The Giulio Cesare was relegated to a training role, spending the rest of the war in port, first at Pola and then at Taranto. The war had taken a heavy toll, but the ship had survived. Now imagine you are a sailor aboard that vessel in 1943. You've fought the British, survived air raids and endured the tedium of inaction. Then comes the news of the armistice. Your government has surrendered, but your country is now a battlefield between your former German allies and the invading Allied forces. What do? For the crew of the Giulio Cesare, the orders were clear. On the 9th of September 1943, she steamed out of Pola, along with other Italian warships, on a perilous journey to surrender to the Allies in Malta. The voyage was fraught with tension. The German Luftwaffe, now an enemy, attacked the Italian fleet, sinking the Cesare's modern sister, the Roma, with a new type of radio-controlled glide bomb. It was a horrific sight, a stark reminder that even in surrender, the sea was a dangerous place. The Cesare arrived safely in Malta and was later used by the British for training, a quiet and somewhat ignominious end to her wartime career. When the war finally ended, the question of her fate arose. The victorious Allied powers were carving up the spoils of war, and the Soviet Union, having borne the brunt of the land war in Europe, demanded a share of the captured Italian fleet as war reparations. Despite objections from the British and Americans, the Soviets got their wish. The Giulio Cesare, along with a cruiser and several smaller vessels, was allocated to the Soviet Navy. In February 1949, after a final refit in Italy, the old battleship sailed from Augusta, Sicily. Her Italian crew, with heavy hearts, handed her over to her new Soviet masters at the Albanian port of Vlorë. The Italian flag was lowered for the last time, and the red banner of the Soviet Navy was hoisted. The Giulio Cesare was no more. In her place was the Novorossiisk, named after a Soviet hero city on the Black Sea. Her second life was about to begin, but it would be far shorter and end in far greater tragedy than her first. When the Soviets took possession of the Novorossiisk, they received a ship that was fundamentally sound but worn out. She had been inactive for years, and much of her equipment was obsolete or in poor condition. The Italians had stripped her of much of her advanced fire control systems and radar before the handover. The Soviets embarked on a series of refits to bring her up to their standards. They replaced her Italian anti-aircraft guns with Soviet-made 37mm cannons, added new Soviet radar systems, and made alterations to her bridge and superstructure. However, they struggled with her complex machinery, which was foreign to their engineers. There were ambitious plans for a more thorough modernization, including replacing her main guns with modern Soviet weapons, but these were repeatedly postponed due to cost and the complexity of the task. Despite these issues, the Novorossiisk was, at the time, the most powerful warship in the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. She became its flagship, a symbol of Soviet naval power and a valuable training vessel for a navy that had little experience with operating large capital ships. For the next 6 years, she participated in training exercises and fleet maneuvers, a proud centerpiece of the Black Sea Fleet. Her service was steady and unremarkable, but beneath the surface, the seeds of disaster were being sown. The ship was old, her systems were a mix of Italian and Soviet technology, and she was being maintained by crews who were not fully familiar with her original design. She was a survivor, a ship that had cheated death many times, but her luck was about to run out in the most spectacular and horrifying way possible. But for all her history of surviving enemy action, the Novorossiisk was about to face a far more insidious and mysterious foe in the one place she should have been safest, her own harbor. This is where her story transforms from a history into a chilling mystery. On the 28th of October 1955, the Novorossiisk returned to the heavily fortified naval base of Sevastopol in Crimea after a gunnery exercise. She tied up to mooring buoy number 3 in the northern bay in about 56 feet of water over a silty, muddy bottom. It was a routine end to a routine day. The crew began the process of standing down and preparing for a day of rest, as the 29th was a public holiday. Most of the ship's senior officers, including the fleet commander, went ashore for the night, leaving the ship under the command of her executive officer. In the early hours of the 29th of October, at approximately 1:30 a.m., a massive explosion tore through the forward section of the ship. The blast was estimated to be the equivalent of over 1,000 kilograms, more than a ton, of TNT. It occurred on the starboard side of the bow, near the forward main gun turret. The explosion ripped a massive hole in the hull, reportedly over 160 square feet in size, and breached multiple watertight compartments. Water began pouring into the ship at an alarming rate. On board, the scene was one of chaos and horror. The explosion had killed everyone in the forward compartments instantly. The bow of the great ship began to settle rapidly as thousands of tons of seawater flooded in. In the darkness, the crew, many of whom had been asleep, struggled to comprehend what had happened. Despite the shock, discipline held. Damage control parties rushed to seal off flooded sections and counter-flood compartments on the port side to correct the growing list. Tugs and rescue vessels from across the harbour raced to the stricken battleship. They helped push the sinking bow towards the shallower water of the shoreline and began taking off wounded and non-essential crewmen. For a time, it seemed like their efforts might succeed. The ship's list was being controlled, and it appeared that she might be stabilized and saved. But the initial damage was far more severe than anyone realized. The flooding was spreading through internal bulkheads that had been weakened by the blast. The ship's list to starboard began to increase, then it shifted to port as the counter-flooding took effect, but then it began to list again, this time more severely. The commanding officer of the Black Sea Fleet, Vice Admiral Viktor Parkhomenko, who had returned to the scene, made a series of fatal miscalculations. Believing the ship could be saved, he delayed the order to abandon ship. He also ordered the large number of rescue personnel and sailors who had gathered on the forecastle to be moved to the stern, thinking it would help balance the ship. In reality, it just concentrated more men on a vessel that was becoming dangerously unstable. At 4:15 a.m., just under 3 hours after the explosion, the Novorossiisk reached a critical angle of list. With a terrible groan of tortured metal, the great battleship capsized and sank, trapping hundreds of men inside her hull. The final death toll was staggering. 608 sailors, including the rescue teams from other ships, lost their lives. It was the worst naval disaster in Russian history during peacetime. In the immediate aftermath, the Soviet government did what it did best. It covered it up. A total information blackout was imposed. Families of the dead sailors were told their loved ones had died in a training accident. The truth of the Novorossiisk disaster remained a state secret for decades. An official investigation was launched, headed by a high-level commission from Moscow. After months of investigation, which included sending divers down to inspect the wreck, the commission delivered its official verdict. The explosion, they concluded, was caused by a German magnetic bottom mine, a remnant of World War II. Sevastopol had been heavily mined by the Germans during the war, and the investigation claimed that the Novorossiisk had likely triggered a mine that had been lying dormant on the seabed for over a decade. They suggested that the dragging of the ship's anchor chains as she moored had disturbed the mine, causing it to detonate. On the surface, this explanation seems plausible. The harbour was known to have been mined, and mine-clearing operations, while extensive, were never 100% perfect. But for many naval experts and historians, this official explanation has always been deeply unsatisfying. The chances of a single mine of that vintage causing such catastrophic damage are considered slim. Furthermore, why would it detonate hours after the ship had moored and not during the mooring process itself? And why had repeated mine-sweeping operations over the years failed to find it? This dissatisfaction has given rise to a far more compelling and dramatic theory, one that points not to a forgotten German mine, but to a deliberate act of vengeance carried out by ghosts from the battleship's past. The leading alternative theory, and the one that has gained the most traction over the years, is that the Novorossiisk was sunk by Italian frogmen. The mastermind behind this alleged operation was Giulio Valerio Borghese, the wartime commander of Italy's elite naval special forces unit, the Decima Flottiglia Mass. Borghese was a fervent nationalist and a committed fascist who never forgave the Allies for Italy's defeat and the subsequent carving up of its navy. The idea of the Giulio Cesare, a ship named for a Roman icon serving under the flag of the Communist Soviet Union, was, in his eyes, an unbearable national humiliation. According to this theory, Borghese, operating secretly after the war, organized a covert mission to sink the ship. He allegedly used veterans of the Decima MAS, men who were experts in underwater sabotage and had pioneered the use of manned torpedoes and combat swimmers during the war. The plan, as a few former MAS members have hinted at over the years, involved using a small, clandestine submersible to transport the frogmen to the entrance of Sevastopol harbor. From there, they would have used advanced underwater breathing apparatus and stealth to penetrate one of the most heavily guarded naval bases in the world. They would have then attached powerful limpet mines to the ship's hull in the dead of night, set the timers, and slipped away undetected. To this day, the Italian government has never officially acknowledged such an operation, and the evidence remains circumstantial. No one has ever produced a smoking gun. But the story persists because it is, in many ways, more believable than the official one. It explains the timing and the power of the blast perfectly, it provides a motive, and it aligns with the known capabilities of the Decima MAS veterans, who were among the best in the world at this type of clandestine warfare. Was it a final, audacious act of war carried out by unrepentant fascists a decade after the conflict had ended? It's a chilling thought. Other, more fringe theories have also been proposed, from an internal KGB plot to discredit the Navy leadership to a secret operation by British intelligence, but none have the enduring, almost cinematic appeal of the Italian frogmen theory. The wreck of the Novorossiisk was eventually raised in 1957 in a massive salvage operation, but by then it was just a ravaged hulk. It was towed away and unceremoniously scrapped. The ship that had been born Giulio Cesare, that had been reborn as a modern battleship, that had survived World War II and had been reborn again as the Novorossiisk, was gone forever. Her legacy is a complex one. As the Giulio Cesare, she was a symbol of Italian naval ambition, an innovative masterpiece of reconstruction that served her country honorably in a losing war. As the Novorossiisk, she was a pawn in Cold War politics, a prize of war that ultimately became a tomb for over 600 sailors. Her story is a microcosm of the 20th century itself, a century of world wars, radical technological change, and shifting ideologies. The official cause of her death remains a German mine, but for many her sinking will always be attributed to a more human, more vengeful force. A final, spectral act of war from an enemy long since defeated. The dual life of the Giulio Cesare serves as a powerful reminder that a ship is more than just steel and machinery. It is a vessel of national pride, a participant in history, and, in this unique case, the central figure in an enduring mystery. Her story poses a fascinating question about vengeance and honor. If the Italian frogmen theory is true, was their act a daring feat of patriotism, righting a perceived wrong? Or was it a senseless act of terrorism that killed hundreds of ordinary sailors in peacetime? There are no easy answers when navigating the murky waters of history and national pride. Let me know in the comments what you believe really happened in Sevastopol harbor that night. And if you enjoy deep dives into the complex and often controversial stories of military history, make sure you have answered the call to arms and hit that subscribe button. The animated general has many more campaigns to cover, and you won't want to miss the briefing.